Montana Territory, 1868. As dawn crept over the Bitterroot Mountains, Preston Norwood stared at the scattered remains of what was once Fort Kearny. The abandoned trading post had been ravaged by years of neglect and violence, much like the hope he once carried within himself. At 26, Preston had seen enough frontier bloodshed to last several lifetimes. His lean frame, hardened by years of cattle driving, carried an invisible weight that no physical strength could shoulder. "No point in rebuilding Waddle, just get torn down again," he muttered, adjusting his worn Stetson over his sandy brown hair. His clean-shaven face, still youthful despite the weathering of frontier life, betrayed no emotion except in his deep-set hazel eyes. Those eyes had witnessed how quickly alliances crumbled in this unforgiving land, how swiftly trust was betrayed when resources grew scarce. Preston had arrived in Montana with 20 other cowboys driving cattle north from Texas, only to find their buyer had been killed in a dispute with local miners. Now, with winter approaching and no destination, the men had scattered to find work where they could. Preston remained, convinced that solitude was safer than connection in a land where today's friend became tomorrow's enemy over a gold claim or a water right. As he mounted his paint horse, a flash of movement caught his eye. 3 riders approached from the east, silhouetted against the rising sun. Preston's hand instinctively moved to his Colt revolver. Trust was a luxury he'd abandoned long ago, along with the naive notion that the frontier was a place for anything but survival. "Mister," called the lead rider, "we're looking for the Blackfoot trading post." Preston watched them carefully as they drew closer. 2 men, 1 woman. The men were clearly trail-worn, but the woman, Preston blinked twice. She sat tall in her saddle, her posture speaking of confidence rather than frontier weariness. Her chestnut brown hair was fastened in a practical braid, though tendrils had escaped to frame a face that seemed too refined for this harsh landscape. She wore a practical riding skirt of dark blue wool and a fitted jacket that suggested Eastern origins. "This was Fort Kearny," Preston responded, gesturing to the dilapidated structures behind him. "Trading stopped 2 years ago after the massacre. Nothing here now but ghosts." The woman urged her horse forward. "I'm Beatrice Morgan," she announced, her voice carrying a quiet authority that took Preston by surprise. "These are my traveling companions, Mr. Holbrook and Mr. Finch. We're here on behalf of the Western Education Society." Preston's brow furrowed. "Education? Ma'am, forgive my bluntness, but you're about 300 miles from the nearest place that might care about such things." Beatrice, who he now observed couldn't be more than 22, fixed him with a determined gaze. "That's precisely why we're here, Mr. Norwood. Preston Norwood." "Mr. Norwood," she continued, "the purpose of education isn't to reach those who already have it, but those who need it most." Despite himself, Preston felt a flicker of curiosity. And who might that be? "The children of both settlers and the Blackfoot people. We've been corresponding with Chief Running Elk, who's agreed to allow us to build a schoolhouse that would serve both communities." Preston couldn't contain a harsh laugh. "Ma'am, I don't know who fed you such fantasies, but settlers and Indians don't share anything except mutual distrust and occasional bloodshed. Perhaps that's because no one has offered them something worth sharing," she responded, unmoved by his cynicism. Preston looked away from her earnest brown eyes, uncomfortable with the hope reflected there. Hope was dangerous. He'd watched it die in men's eyes as they bled out from arrow wounds, or starved during harsh winters, or lost everything to outlaws or nature's fury. The frontier didn't reward hope, it crushed it. "Well, I wish you luck with your mission, Miss Morgan," he said dismissively. "You'll need it." "Actually," she pressed, "we need more than luck. We need someone who knows the territory, who can help us navigate between the settler communities and the Blackfoot." The chief mentioned a cowboy who once saved his son from drowning in the Marias River. He said this man might be willing to help us. He described a man with a paint horse and a scar across his left forearm. Preston unconsciously touched the jagged scar beneath his sleeve, a memento from that day 2 years ago when he'd pulled a drowning boy from raging waters without considering what tribe the child belonged to. It had been simple human instinct, not heroism. "That was before the massacre," Preston said flatly. "Things have changed. Have they?" Beatrice challenged. "Or have people simply stopped trying to see beyond their differences?" Preston regarded her carefully. There was something disarming about her directness, about the way she spoke of impossible things as if they were merely difficult rather than fantastical. But Preston had long ago decided that the frontier was no place for dreamers. Dreams died quick out here, often taking their owners with them. I can point you toward the nearest settler town and give you directions to the Blackfoot winter camp, he offered. But that's all. Whatever peace you think you can build won't last through the first spring thaw. Beatrice studied him for a long moment. The Western Education Society is prepared to pay handsomely for a guide who can help us establish relations with both communities. Money. Now she was speaking a language the frontier understood. Preston considered his dwindling supplies and the approaching winter. A paying job would see him through until spring, when he could join another cattle drive heading north. $3 a day plus provisions, he countered. For 2 weeks. Enough time to show you why this idea of yours can't work, and then get you safely back to wherever you came from. Beatrice smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her face from merely beautiful to radiant. Deal, Mr. Norwood. Though I suspect it will take more than 2 weeks to show you why it can. Preston didn't return her smile, but he did extend his hand to seal the agreement. As their palms met, he ignored the unfamiliar warmth that traveled up his arm. Attachments were temporary out here. People left, or died, or revealed themselves to be something other than what they seemed. This woman with her impossible vision would learn that soon enough. And Preston would be there to see her safely away when she did. We make for Elk Creek settlement first, he said, releasing her hand. Best to establish yourself with the settlers before approaching the Blackfoot camp. As Preston led the small party west, he couldn't shake the feeling that in agreeing to guide Beatrice Morgan, he'd set in motion something that would challenge every hard truth he'd learned about frontier survival. The notion was unsettling. He'd built his life around the certainty that the frontier was a place for lone wolves, not bridge builders. Yet with each glance back at the determined young woman who rode with the grace of someone who believed in her purpose, Preston found himself wondering if there were truths about the West he had yet to discover. Elk Creek settlement consisted of 37 rough-hewn cabins clustered around a general store, a saloon, and a small church still under construction. As Preston led the education party into town, curious faces appeared in doorways and windows. Strangers were always a source of interest and potential danger. They're wary, Preston explained as they dismounted outside the general store. New faces mean either opportunity or trouble. And which are we? Beatrice asked, straightening her skirts. That depends on how they receive your proposition. Preston helped her step onto the boardwalk, surprised by the slightness of her waist beneath his hands. For someone with such formidable determination, she felt remarkably delicate. Inside the store, they found Moses Wheeler, the unofficial mayor of Elk Creek and owner of the largest cattle operation in the area. The barrel-chested man squinted suspiciously at the newcomers. Norwood, he acknowledged gruffly. Thought you'd moved on with the rest of that Texas outfit. Found employment with these folks, Preston replied. They're looking to establish a school hereabouts. Wheeler's eyebrows rose. A school? Out here. Beatrice stepped forward. Mr. Wheeler, I'm Beatrice Morgan of the Western Education Society. We believe education is the foundation of civilization, even, perhaps especially, on the frontier. Civilization's a mighty fine thing, Miss Morgan, Wheeler responded, but it takes a back seat to survival out here. I would argue they're one and the same, she countered. Children who can read maps, calculate supplies, and understand written warnings have better chances of survival than those who cannot. Wheeler considered her words. You may have a point there, but where would this school be built? And who would attend? We hope to construct it on neutral ground between here and the Blackfoot winter camp. Chief Running Elk has expressed interest in having his people's children educated alongside settler children. A heavy silence fell over the store. Wheeler's face darkened. Indians and white children together? After what happened at Fort Kearny, the massacre was perpetrated by a rogue band of Crow warriors, not the Blackfoot, Preston found himself saying, surprising even himself with his defense. Wheeler turned a skeptical gaze to Preston. Since when do you defend Indians, Norwood? Thought you were the one always saying a man can only count on himself out here. Preston shifted uncomfortably, aware of Beatrice's eyes on him. I'm just stating facts. The Blackfoot weren't responsible for Fort Kearny. Facts don't change feelings, Wheeler replied grimly. There's not a family here that hasn't lost someone to Indian attacks. And there's not a tribe that hasn't lost many to settler expansion, Beatrice interjected gently. Perhaps that's precisely why we need this school, to begin healing those wounds before the next generation inherits them. Wheeler studied her for a long moment. You speak pretty words, Miss Morgan, but this isn't Boston or Philadelphia. Out here, pretty words don't stop arrows or bullets. No, she agreed, but understanding might prevent them from being fired in the first place. Her quiet conviction seemed to give Wheeler pause. He stroked his beard thoughtfully. Tell you what, he finally said. You get Chief Running Elk to come to a town meeting. If he'll sit and talk peacefully with us about this school of yours, I'll consider supporting it. But I won't promise more than consideration. That's all I ask, Beatrice said with a small, victorious smile. As they left the store, Preston shook his head in disbelief. You actually got him to listen. I've never seen Wheeler bend on anything related to the tribes. I didn't change his mind, Beatrice corrected. I just opened it a crack. That's how light gets in. Preston studied her in the afternoon sun, wondering how someone could maintain such hope in a place that systematically crushed it. You really believe this can work, don't you? Indians and settlers sharing a schoolhouse. I believe children don't enter the world hating each other, she replied. They have to be taught that. Perhaps they can be taught something different instead. As they walked toward the boarding house where they would stay the night, Preston found himself wanting to protect Beatrice from the inevitable disappointment that awaited her. The frontier had a way of grinding down idealism until nothing remained but pragmatic survival. The Blackfoot camp is a day's ride northwest, he said. We'll head there tomorrow. But I should warn you. Chief Running Elk may have agreed to correspond with your society, but that doesn't mean his people will welcome this idea. Beatrice nodded. I understand the challenges, Mr. Norwood. I've spent the past year studying the history of relations between settlers and native peoples. I harbor no illusions about the difficulties ahead. Studying history in books is different from living it, Preston cautioned. Her eyes met his, surprisingly fierce. My father was killed by Comanche raiders when I was 15. Our farmhouse in Kansas was burned to the ground. I watched it happen from where my mother had hidden me in the root cellar. Preston felt as though she'd struck him. I'm sorry. I didn't know. If you do, I don't share it often. Her voice softened. But I tell you this so you understand. I'm not a naive girl playing at frontier reform. I've seen the worst of what hatred can do. That's precisely why I believe we must find another way forward. In that moment, Preston saw Beatrice Morgan clearly for the first time, not as a misguided idealist, but as someone whose hope had been forged in fire rather than extinguished by it. The realization unsettled him deeply. If she could witness such violence and still believe in reconciliation, what did that say about his own retreat into isolation? Get some rest, he said abruptly, uncomfortable with the direction of his thoughts. Tomorrow will be a long day. As he walked away toward the stable where he preferred to sleep rather than in the boarding house, Preston couldn't shake the feeling that in Beatrice Morgan, he'd encountered someone who challenged not just his beliefs about the frontier, but about himself. The Blackfoot winter camp sprawled across a sheltered valley, dozens of hide teepees arranged in a great circle. Smoke curled from their tops into the crisp morning air as Preston led the small party toward the camp entrance. He felt the familiar tension that always accompanied approaching a native encampment. Not fear exactly, but acute awareness that he was entering a world with different rules and expectations than his own. Remember, he cautioned Beatrice, who rode beside him. Among the Blackfoot, patience is valued. Don't rush to state your purpose. Wait to be invited to speak. She nodded, her face composed despite the nervousness Preston detected in her tight grip on the reins. Her companions, Holbrook and Finch, looked considerably less composed. Warriors on horseback approached, their expressions guarded. Preston raised his hand in greeting, then spoke the few Blackfoot phrases he knew. One of the warriors nodded in recognition. You saved Swimming Otter, he said in accented English. Chief's son. Yes, Preston confirmed. We've come to speak with Chief Running Elk about the school the Woman's Society wishes to build. The warriors exchanged glances, then gestured for the group to follow. As they rode into the camp, curious eyes followed their progress. Children darted between teepees to watch the strangers, while women paused in their work to observe. At the center of the camp, before a large teepee decorated with painted symbols of authority, sat Chief Running Elk. Though in his 50s, he carried himself with the straight-backed dignity of a much younger man. Beside him sat a boy of about 12, Swimming Otter, whom Preston had pulled from the river 2 years before. The boy's eyes widened in recognition, and he whispered something to his father. The chief nodded slightly. "Dismount and approach," one of the warriors instructed. As Preston helped Beatrice down from her horse, he whispered, "Let me speak first." They approached the chief and stopped at a respectful distance. Preston removed his hat. "Chief Running Elk, I am Preston Norwood. 2 summers ago, I was fortunate to help your son when he was caught in the river's fury." The chief studied him. "The river spirit tested my son's strength that day. You helped him pass the test." His gaze shifted to Beatrice. "Is this the woman who writes about teaching our children?" Preston gestured for Beatrice to step forward. With graceful composure, she bowed her head slightly. "I am Beatrice Morgan of the Western Education Society, Chief Running Elk. Thank you for receiving us." The chief motioned for them to sit on the blankets arranged before him. "My people have watched the white man's writing magic for many years. We have seen how it gives power. Power to make treaties, power to break them, power to remember what was promised." Beatrice nodded. "Writing is indeed powerful. It allows us to capture words so they cannot be forgotten or changed. And this is what you would teach our children? This writing magic. Reading, writing, mathematics, history, natural sciences. Knowledge that would serve them in understanding both their world and the changing one around them." Running Elk's expression remained impassive. "And why would the white settlers allow their children to learn alongside Blackfoot children?" "Because knowledge grows stronger when shared," Beatrice replied. "Because both peoples must find ways to live together as neighbors rather than enemies." The chief considered her words. "Pretty thoughts. But the settlers at Elk Creek still blame Blackfoot for attacks we did not commit. They restrict our hunting grounds and fear our presence. That is why we've come to you first," Beatrice said. "Mr. Wheeler at Elk Creek has agreed to consider the school if you would come to the settlement to discuss it with the community." A murmur ran through the gathered tribal members. The chief's advisor leaned in, speaking rapidly in their native tongue. Running Elk raised a hand for silence. "The last chief who went to a white settlement for talks did not return to his people," he said gravely. Preston felt Beatrice tense beside him. This was the moment where her vision could shatter against the hard reality of frontier distrust. To his surprise, she turned to him. "Mr. Norwood," she said clearly, "would you guarantee Chief Running Elk's safety with your life if he were to attend this meeting?" Every eye turned to Preston. The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Preston had spent years avoiding entanglements, responsibilities beyond himself. His creed had been simple. Survival meant standing apart, not between. Yet as he looked at Beatrice's expectant face, then at the chief and the boy whose life he had once saved without hesitation, Preston felt something shift inside him. Perhaps there were things worth risking safety for. "I would," he said firmly. "On my honor as the man who returned your son to you. I swear no harm will come to you at this meeting." Running Elk studied him intently, seeming to look beyond Preston's words to the truth of the man himself. Finally, he nodded. 3 days from now, I will come to Elk Creek with 4 of my warriors. We will listen to this school proposal." His eyes narrowed slightly. "But Swimming Otter stays here. A father does not risk both his own life and his son's on the same day." "Understood," Preston said, relieved yet suddenly aware of the responsibility he had just assumed. "We will prepare the townspeople for your arrival." As they prepared to leave, Swimming Otter approached Preston. "You remember me?" the boy asked in careful English. Preston nodded. "I remember. You fought hard against the river that day." The boy smiled. "I learned English from Trader before he leave. I want to learn more. Learn writing magic. That's why Miss Morgan is here," Preston replied, surprised by the warmth he felt at the boy's enthusiasm. "You help her build school?" Preston hesitated, caught between his intended temporary arrangement and the hope in the boy's eyes. "I'm helping her try," he answered truthfully. Swimming Otter nodded as if this confirmed something important. "Good. She has strong medicine. You too." As they rode away from the camp, Beatrice was unusually quiet. Finally, she spoke. "Thank you for what you did back there. Offering yourself as guarantee of the chief's safety. That was more than I had any right to ask of you." Preston kept his eyes on the trail ahead. "It was necessary if you wanted any chance of this meeting happening." "Yes, but that doesn't explain why you did it." You've made it quite clear you believe this entire endeavor is doomed to failure. Preston considered her question. Why had he put himself at risk for a project he didn't believe in? The answer unsettled him. Sometimes a man has to stand for something, even if he's not sure it will succeed, he finally said. Otherwise, what's the point of surviving at all? Beatrice studied him with a look that suggested she was seeing past the barriers he had so carefully constructed. That's not the philosophy of a man who believes the frontier is no place for connection, Mr. Norwood. Preston had no reply to that uncomfortable truth. Instead, he urged his horse to a faster pace, as if he could outrun the realization that Beatrice Morgan was slowly dismantling the walls he'd built around himself. Walls that had kept him safe, but also terribly alone. The town meeting at Elk Creek was set for noon, but tensions had been rising since dawn. Preston had spent the previous day explaining the situation to key community members, emphasizing the potential benefits of educating the next generation together. Some, particularly families with young children, had shown cautious interest. Others, especially those who had lost loved ones in frontier violence, remained openly hostile to the idea. By mid-morning, the town's small church was packed. Preston stood near the door, watching as Beatrice calmly arranged papers on a small table at the front. Despite the barely contained hostility in the room, she moved with a composed grace that he couldn't help but admire. "She's either the bravest woman I've ever met or the most foolish," muttered Moses Wheeler, who had taken a position beside Preston. "Perhaps there's less distance between those qualities than we think," Preston replied. Wheeler grunted. "You've changed your tune, Norwood. When you first rode into town, you were the last man I'd expect to support Indians and settlers breaking bread together." Before Preston could respond, a hush fell over the gathering. Through the church windows, they could see Chief Running Elk and his 4 warriors approaching on horseback. Preston moved quickly outside to meet them. "Chief," he greeted with a respectful nod. "Thank you for coming." Running Elk dismounted, his face a careful mask. "I come because you gave your word, and because my son believes learning the white man's ways may help our people survive." Preston led the Blackfoot delegation into the church, acutely aware of the sudden tension crackling through the room. Some settlers reached instinctively for weapons that weren't there. Firearms had been prohibited for the meeting. Beatrice stepped forward. "Chief Running Elk, warriors of the Blackfoot Nation, thank you for accepting our invitation. Please, be seated here." She indicated chairs arranged at the front beside her own. The chief and his men moved forward with dignity, though Preston noted how they positioned themselves to watch the entire room. Years of broken treaties and ambushes had taught them caution. Beatrice addressed the gathered townspeople. "Friends, neighbors, thank you for coming today. We are here to discuss something unprecedented in this territory, a school that would serve both settler and Blackfoot children, teaching skills and knowledge that would benefit both communities." "And why should we want our children mixing with savages?" called a voice from the back. Preston recognized Samuel Reed, who had lost his brother to an Indian attack 2 years prior. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Running Elk remained impassive, though his warriors tensed. Beatrice didn't flinch. "Mr. Reed, I understand your concern. Many here have suffered losses. So too have the Blackfoot people. The question before us is whether we allow those losses to determine our children's future or whether we seek a different path forward." "Fine words," Reed spat. "But words don't bring back the dead." "No," agreed Chief Running Elk, speaking for the first time. "Words do not return those taken by violence. Not your brother. Not my father, killed by soldiers. Not my sister's husband, shot by fur trappers." The church fell silent at his direct acknowledgement of mutual suffering. "But I have seen what happens when we teach our children only to remember wounds," the chief continued. "They become warriors who create more orphans, more widows, more reason for revenge. This wheel turns without end." Moses Wheeler stepped forward. "What exactly would this school teach, Miss Morgan? And where would it be built?" Beatrice seized the opportunity to shift to practical matters. "Reading, writing, mathematics, natural sciences, knowledge useful to any child's future. As for location, we propose building on the neutral ground between Elk Creek and the winter camp, where the old trading post once stood." "Fort Kearney?" Wheeler asked skeptically. "That's been abandoned since the massacre." "The land remains fertile and central to both communities," Beatrice explained. The Western Education Society would provide funding for construction and a teacher's salary for 5 years. After that time, if the school proved successful, the communities would share its maintenance. As Beatrice outlined the practical details, Preston watched the faces of the townspeople. Some remained skeptical, but others showed cautious interest. More importantly, he noticed the wives nudging their husbands, mothers whispering about opportunities for their children that they themselves had never had. "And who would teach at this school?" asked Sarah Daniels, the wife of the town's blacksmith. "Surely you don't expect us to send our children miles away to be taught by someone we don't know or trust." Beatrice smiled. "Actually, Mrs. Daniels, I would be the teacher, at least initially. I was educated at Mount Holyoke Female Seminary and have taught for 3 years in frontier schools in Kansas." This revelation caused a stir. Preston himself felt surprised, though he realized he shouldn't have been. Of course, Beatrice wasn't simply a representative of some distant society. Her passion for the project was too personal for that. The meeting continued for nearly 2 hours, with questions, objections, and occasional moments of genuine dialogue between the settlers and the Blackfoot delegation. Throughout it all, Beatrice moderated with patient determination, never dismissing concerns, but always steering the conversation back to the children's futures. Finally, Wheeler raised his hand. "I think we've heard enough for today. Miss Morgan has given us much to consider. I propose we take a week to discuss among ourselves, then vote on whether to support this school." Nods of agreement passed through the gathering. As people began to disperse, Preston moved to where Beatrice stood speaking quietly with Chief Running Elk. "You've given them something to think about," Preston told the chief. "That's more than many thought possible." Running Elk nodded. "The woman speaks with a good heart. But words must become actions to have meaning." "If they vote to support the school," Beatrice asked, "would you still be willing to send Blackfoot children?" "Some would come," the chief confirmed. "Others would wait, watch. Trust grows slowly in soil soaked with blood." After the Blackfoot delegation departed, Preston escorted Beatrice back to the boarding house. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dirt street, and the tension of the meeting had left them both weary. "You did well today," Preston said, breaking their companionable silence. Beatrice smiled tiredly. "We've only just begun. There's so much more to overcome." "Yes, but you've accomplished something I would have thought impossible a week ago. You got them talking instead of shooting." She stopped walking and turned to face him. "And what about you, Mr. Norwood? Have I accomplished the impossible with you as well?" Preston met her gaze, finding himself unable to look away from those earnest brown eyes. "What do you mean?" "You said the frontier was no place for dreamers. That connections don't last out here. Yet today I saw you standing between 2 communities, building bridges rather than walls." Her perception unsettled him. Preston looked away. "I made a commitment to ensure the chief's safety. That's all." "Is it?" Beatrice stepped closer. "Or are you discovering that perhaps your belief about frontier isolation was wrong? That perhaps there are things worth risking safety for?" The directness of her question, and its accuracy, left Preston momentarily speechless. Before he could form a response, Moses Wheeler called to him from across the street. "Norwood, need a word with you." Preston nodded in acknowledgement, then turned back to Beatrice. "Excuse me. We'll continue this conversation later." As he walked away, Preston felt both relief at the interruption and a strange disappointment. Beatrice Morgan was making him question certainties he'd lived by for years, and the most troubling part was that he wasn't sure he wanted to stop her. Over the next several days, Preston found himself increasingly drawn into Beatrice's vision. What had begun as a simple guiding job transformed as he accompanied her to visit outlying homesteads, explaining the school proposal to families too distant to have attended the meeting. To his surprise, he found himself not merely translating her ideas, but advocating for them with growing conviction. On their 4th day of visits, they stopped to water their horses at a creek. The autumn sun warmed the afternoon, glinting off Beatrice's chestnut hair as she removed her bonnet to enjoy the breeze. "May I ask you something personal?" she said suddenly. Preston nodded, curious. "What happened to make you believe the frontier was no place for connection, for trust?" The question struck at memories Preston rarely revisited. He almost deflected it, but something in Beatrice's genuine interest made him reconsider. "I came west with my brother after the war," he began slowly. "James was 3 years older, always the leader between us. We had dreams of building a cattle empire in Montana." Preston paused, the familiar ache of loss rising within him. 2 years in, we'd saved enough to buy our first small herd. We trusted a man in Helena to hold our money until the cattle auction. He seemed respectable, a former army captain, churchgoer, family man. His jaw tightened at the memory. He disappeared with our savings and those of 5 other hopeful ranchers. James couldn't accept it. He tracked the man for months, finally confronted him in a mining camp near the Idaho Territory. Beatrice's expression softened with understanding. He didn't survive the confrontation. Preston shook his head, shot in the back by the man's accomplice. I arrived a day too late. He met her eyes. That's when I learned that out here, trust is a luxury that gets people killed. Better to rely only on yourself, expect betrayal, and be pleasantly surprised on the rare occasions it doesn't come. Beatrice was quiet for a moment. Then she moved closer and, to Preston's surprise, gently touched his arm. I'm truly sorry about your brother, she said. But I wonder if you've drawn the wrong lesson from that terrible experience. Preston stiffened. Seems clear enough to me. Does it? Her eyes held his. You trusted one dishonest man, yes. But consider this past week. You trusted Chief Running Elk to come peacefully to the meeting. You trusted the townspeople to listen without violence. You trusted me enough to share your painful history just now. Her logic caught him off guard. That's different. Is it? Or have you actually been selectively trusting people all along, just while telling yourself you trust no one? Her voice softened. Perhaps the true lesson isn't that trust itself is dangerous, but that we must be wise about where we place it. Preston had no immediate response. Her observation had struck too close to a truth he hadn't been ready to acknowledge, that his supposed self-reliance was more complicated than he pretended. Before he could formulate a reply, hoofbeats approached. They turned to see a rider from Elk Creek galloping toward them. Miss Morgan. Mr. Norwood, the young man called as he reined his horse to a stop. Mr. Wheeler sent me. The town voted on the school proposal. Preston felt Beatrice tense beside him. And? She asked. 23 for, 18 against. It passed, ma'am. They're willing to support the school if the Blackfoot still agree. The joy that transformed Beatrice's face in that moment struck Preston with unexpected force. Her entire being seemed illuminated from within. Thank you, she breathed. Please tell Mr. Wheeler we'll visit Chief Running Elk immediately to confirm their participation. As the messenger rode away, Beatrice turned to Preston, eyes shining. Without warning, she threw her arms around him in a spontaneous embrace. We did it. The first step, anyway. Preston found himself returning her embrace before propriety reasserted itself, and they stepped apart. The brief contact left him strangely disoriented, aware of her in ways he had been trying to ignore. We should get to the Blackfoot camp before nightfall, he said, his voice rougher than intended. As they mounted their horses, Preston caught Beatrice studying him with a small smile. What? He asked. Nothing, she replied. I'm just thinking that for a man convinced connections don't last on the frontier, you seem remarkably good at building them. Preston urged his horse forward, unwilling to examine too closely the warmth her words created within him, or the growing fear that when her school was established and their contract complete, he would feel her absence more keenly than he cared to admit. The news was received with cautious optimism at the Blackfoot camp. Chief Running Elk agreed to send 12 children initially, including his son's swimming otter, to attend the school once it was built. With both communities committed, the work of construction could begin. Within days, the abandoned site of Fort Kearny became a hive of activity. Settlers from Elk Creek and warriors from the Blackfoot camp worked side by side, awkwardly at first, then with growing coordination. Beatrice moved among them, her enthusiasm infectious as she described the school that would rise from the ruins of the trading post. Preston found himself appointed as unofficial foreman, his experience with frontier construction making him valuable to the project. Despite his initial skepticism, he discovered unexpected satisfaction in watching the structure take shape, a physical manifestation of Beatrice's vision becoming reality. One evening, as sunset painted the half-built schoolhouse in golden light, Preston found Beatrice sitting alone on a pile of lumber, sketching in a small notebook. Planning tomorrow's work? He asked, settling beside her. She showed him the drawing, a simple sketch of children, both settler and Blackfoot, gathered around a teacher's desk. Reminding myself what we're building toward, she explained. Sometimes in the details of construction, it's easy to lose sight of the purpose. Preston studied the drawing, struck by the simple power of the image. You really believe this will work, don't you? Not just the building, but what happens inside it. I have to, she said softly. Otherwise, what's the point? Her words echoed his own from days earlier. Preston found himself smiling at the parallel. You know, he said, when you first arrived with this wild idea, I gave it 2 weeks before you'd be heading back east, disillusioned. And now, Preston hesitated, then decided on honesty. Now I find myself hoping you'll prove me wrong. About everything. The look Beatrice gave him held such warmth that Preston felt something shift inside him, a wall crumbling that he had maintained for years. Preston, she said, using his given name for the first time, may I tell you something? He nodded, suddenly unable to look away from her face in the fading light. When the Education Society chose me for this assignment, many questioned whether a woman of 22 could possibly succeed in such a challenging environment. Some suggested I would need to marry a local man simply to have protection. She smiled slightly. I was determined to prove I could accomplish this mission through my own abilities, without becoming dependent on anyone. Preston waited, sensing there was more. But working with you these past weeks has shown me something important, she continued. True strength isn't found in stubborn independence, but in knowing when to stand alone and when to stand together. Her eyes held his. I've been fighting the same fear as you, just from the opposite direction. Her confession startled Preston. He had seen only her confidence, her unwavering commitment to her vision. The revelation that she too struggled with questions of dependence and vulnerability made her suddenly more real to him, and more compelling. Seems we've both been wrong in our own ways, he said quietly. Perhaps, she agreed. Or perhaps we've simply been incomplete. The implication in her words hung between them, charged with possibility. Preston found himself leaning toward her, drawn by a force he no longer wanted to resist. Beatrice's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't move away. Their moment was interrupted by shouts from the workers' camp. They turned to see a rider approaching at speed, one of the young men from Elk Creek. Mr. Norwood. Miss Morgan, the rider called, his voice tense with urgency. Trouble coming. Preston was on his feet immediately. What kind of trouble? Reed and some others, the young man panted. They're riled up, been drinking. Say they won't let Indian children learn alongside theirs. They're coming here, with guns. Preston felt a cold clarity descend over him. This was the moment he had feared from the beginning. The inevitable collapse of Beatrice's fragile vision beneath the weight of frontier hatred. How many, he asked. 8, maybe 10. They left town about an hour behind me. Preston turned to Beatrice, whose face had gone pale. You need to leave. Now, go to the Blackfoot camp. They'll protect you until this blows over. Her expression hardened with resolve. I will not abandon this school, Preston. Not after everything we've accomplished. Beatrice, these men are drunk and armed. This isn't the time for what? She challenged. For standing by my principles? For defending what we've built together? Preston recognized the futility of arguing with her. Fine, but you stay inside the schoolhouse. I'll handle Reed and his men. As they prepared for the confrontation, Preston gathered the workers, 6 settlers, and 4 Blackfoot warriors who had been helping with construction. He explained the situation quickly. No one needs to die over this, he concluded. But we need to show a united front. These men are counting on the Blackfoot and settlers turning against each other at the first sign of trouble. To Preston's surprise, Moses Wheeler stepped forward from among the workers. Norwood's right. We voted as a town. We gave our word. I won't let a few hotheads destroy what we've started here. The Blackfoot warriors standing elk nodded in agreement. My chief has also given his word. We stand together. As dusk deepened into night, they positioned themselves before the half-built schoolhouse. Preston insisted Beatrice remain inside, though he knew from her expression that she would not stay there if violence erupted. The sound of approaching riders came first, hoofbeats and rough voices carrying through the darkness. Then came the flicker of torches as Reed and his companions rode into view. Preston stepped forward, his hand resting near his holstered revolver, but not on it. Evening, gentlemen. You're a long way from town. Samuel Reed's face was flushed with whiskey and anger. Out of the way, Norwood. We've come to burn this abomination to the ground before it poisons our children. This schoolhouse was approved by town vote. Preston replied evenly. You're too late to stop it. Vote be damned, Reed spat. No one asked my brother if he wanted to die at Indian hands. No one's asking these children if they want to sit next to savages. Preston was about to respond when the schoolhouse door opened behind him. Beatrice emerged, her figure straight and unafraid in the torchlight. Mr. Reed, she called, her voice clear and steady. These children you claim to protect, what future do you envision for them? Reed seemed taken aback by her direct question. A safe one, a proper one, with their own kind. And when they grow up, she pressed, will they continue the cycle of fear and violence that claimed your brother? Or might they build something better if given the chance to understand their neighbors? Understanding won't bring back the dead, Reed said, but some of the fire had gone from his voice. No, agreed a new voice from the darkness. Chief Running Elk emerged from the shadows, accompanied by several warriors. The dead remain with the spirits, but the living must find a way forward, or more will join the dead. The arrival of additional Blackfoot warriors visibly unsettled Reed's companions. Several exchanged nervous glances, their bravado diminishing as they recognized they were now outnumbered. Reed, however, grew more agitated. See? They were waiting to ambush us. This proves everything I've been saying. Preston stepped directly in front of Reed's horse. The only one threatening violence here is you, Reed. The chief came because he heard you plan to destroy something his people have helped build, something for his son's future. My son, Running Elk confirmed, moving to stand beside Preston, and your children too. They can inherit our hatred, or they can inherit a chance for peace. Tonight, you choose which gift you give them. The simple dignity of the chief's words seemed to reach through Reed's anger. He looked around at his companions, many of whom were now clearly having second thoughts. This isn't over, Reed muttered, but the threat in his voice had hollowed. Yes, Preston said firmly. It is. After a tense moment, Reed jerked his horse around. Come on, boys. We'll settle this another time. As the riders departed, the tension slowly ebbed from the gathering. Preston found himself standing between Chief Running Elk and Beatrice, a physical embodiment of the bridge they were attempting to build. Thank you, Beatrice said to the chief. Your words may have prevented bloodshed tonight. Running Elk nodded. Words are sometimes stronger than arrows. This is what we hope the children will learn in your school. As the chief and his warriors prepared to return to their camp, Running Elk turned to Preston. You stood between. Not many white men would do this. The simple statement carried unexpected weight. Preston had indeed stood between, not just physically tonight, but increasingly in every aspect of this endeavor. He had crossed the boundaries he once believed necessary for survival and found not vulnerability, but a different kind of strength. After the others had gone, Preston and Beatrice remained alone before the half-built schoolhouse. The night was clear, stars scattered across the sky like distant campfires. I thought tonight would be the end of everything, Beatrice admitted quietly. So did I, Preston confessed. I was ready to see all your work destroyed, all your hopes crushed by frontier reality. She turned to him, her face serious in the moonlight. And would you have been satisfied? To be proven right about the impossibility of connection here. The question struck at the heart of his transformation these past weeks. Preston shook his head slowly. No, he said, the truth of it settling into his bones. I would have mourned it. Because you've shown me something I'd forgotten. That survival alone isn't enough reason to keep breathing. Beatrice stepped closer, close enough that he could see the emotion in her eyes. Preston, she said softly, our contract ends when the school is completed. What happens then? The question carried implications that both thrilled and terrified him. For years, Preston had avoided entanglements, commitments that might lead to loss. Yet the thought of Beatrice Morgan leaving once the school was built left him with an emptiness he could no longer ignore. I don't know, he admitted. I only know I don't want to go back to the man I was before you arrived. Beatrice's smile was like sunrise after the darkest night. Then don't. This time, when Preston leaned toward her, there were no interruptions. Their kiss was gentle at first, then deepening with the acknowledgement of feelings that had been building since that first meeting at the abandoned fort. When they finally drew apart, Preston felt as though some essential truth had been revealed to him, that in opening himself to the possibility of loss, he had found something far more precious than safety. I still have a school to build, Beatrice whispered against his cheek. Preston smiled. We have a school to build, he corrected. And perhaps something more besides. By early spring of 1869, the Elk Creek School stood completed on the site of the former Fort Kearny. Its sturdy log walls and cedar-shingled roof spoke of permanence, of intention to weather both seasons and challenges. Inside, rows of simple desks faced a larger teacher's desk, behind which hung a large slate board for lessons. On opening day, Preston stood on the porch, watching his families approach from both directions, settlers from Elk Creek to the east, Blackfoot families from the west. The nervousness on both sides was palpable, but so was the curiosity, particularly among the children. Beatrice emerged from the schoolhouse, dressed in a simple blue dress that complemented her chestnut hair, now arranged in a practical but becoming style. Her face glowed with the culmination of her vision, but Preston noted the hint of anxiety in her eyes as she surveyed the approaching families. They're coming, she said softly. From both sides. Preston took her hand, a gesture that no longer needed hiding. In the months of building the school, their own relationship had developed alongside it, growing from cautious attraction to deep commitment. Of course they are, he reassured her. How could they resist a teacher who convinced a confirmed loner like me to believe in connection? Her smile eased some of the tension from her face. It wasn't just me. You were ready to change. Perhaps, he conceded. Or perhaps you simply reminded me of the man I was meant to be all along. As the families gathered before the school, Preston observed the careful distance maintained between the settler and Blackfoot groups. Breaking down that separation would take more than a building. It would take the daily work of learning together, of children forming friendships that might eventually transform their communities. Swimming Otter was among the first Blackfoot children to approach. Now 13, he had grown taller over the winter. He nodded respectfully to Preston before turning to Beatrice. I am ready to learn the writing magic, he stated with determination. Sarah Daniels' daughter Emily, a shy girl of 11, stood nearby with several other settler children. Her mother gave her a gentle push forward. Go on, she encouraged. Introduce yourself properly. With visible effort, Emily stepped towards Swimming Otter. Hello, she said. I'm Emily. The boy regarded her solemnly, then offered a small smile. I am Swimming Otter. Perhaps we can learn together. Preston exchanged a glance with Beatrice, sharing a moment of quiet triumph at this simple exchange, the first tentative bridge between the children. Beatrice stepped forward to address the gathered families. Welcome to the first day of our school. I know this is new for everyone, and perhaps a little frightening, but I believe what we begin here today will benefit all our children and communities for generations to come. As she continued speaking, outlining her plans for the school term, Preston moved to stand beside Moses Wheeler and Chief Running Elk, who had positioned themselves at the edge of the gathering. Quite a thing you've helped build, Norwood, Wheeler commented. Never thought I'd see the day. Nor I, agreed Running Elk. But good change comes when brave hearts open to new possibilities. Preston nodded, watching as Beatrice began to usher the children into the schoolhouse. It took someone believing it was possible before the rest of us could see it. The school? Wheeler asked. That, Preston agreed. And everything else. As the children filed inside, their parents remained outside, still separated by history and habit. That would take longer to change. But watching the children, settler and Blackfoot together, cross the threshold of the school, Preston felt a certainty that transformation had begun. Later that evening, after the first day of classes had concluded and the families had returned to their respective homes, Preston and Beatrice walked alone along the creek that ran behind the schoolhouse. The setting sun painted the water in shades of gold and amber. 26 students, Beatrice said, still sounding amazed. More than we dared hope for. They'll tell others, Preston predicted. By summer, you'll need a larger classroom. She leaned against him, fitting perfectly beneath his arm. We'll build it then. Together. The casual certainty of her words, the assumption that their futures were now intertwined, filled Preston with a contentment he had never expected to find on the frontier. For years, he had believed that this land demanded isolation as the price of survival. Beatrice had shown him a different truth, that true survival required connection, required standing between rather than apart. I have something for you, Preston said, reaching into his pocket. A small token to mark this day. He handed her a simply carved wooden box. Inside, nestled on a scrap of velvet, lay a ring, a band of silver set with a small Montana sapphire. Beatrice's eyes widened as she registered its meaning. "Preston, I know it's not fancy," he said quickly, "but I had it made in Helena last month. The silver came from Montana mountains, the sapphire from a creek not 50 miles from here." He took a breath. "Like us, it belongs to this place." Tears welled in Beatrice's eyes as she looked from the ring to his face. "Are you asking me?" Preston took her hands in his. "Beatrice Morgan, you came here to build a school that would bridge two cultures. But you've done something far more impossible. You've rebuilt a man who thought himself beyond repair." His voice grew rough with emotion. "I love you. Will you marry me and continue building our life here, together?" Her answer came not in words, but in the way she threw her arms around him, the ring clutched tightly in her hand, her tears warm against his neck. When she finally pulled back to look at him, her smile was radiant. "Yes," she said simply. "Of course, yes." As Preston slipped the ring onto her finger, he marveled at how completely his life had transformed in less than a year. From the lone cowboy convinced that the frontier permitted no lasting connections, he had become part of something larger than himself, a community being forged across cultural divides, and a love that promised to endure beyond the harshness of frontier life. The schoolhouse stood behind them, solid and real, a testament to what could be built when hope overcame cynicism, when bridges replaced barriers. But as Preston held Beatrice close in the gathering twilight, he knew that the most important thing they had built was less visible, the belief that even in the wildest places, perhaps especially there, the human heart could find its home in connection rather than isolation. "Our contract is complete, Miss Morgan," he whispered teasingly against her hair. "The school is built." Beatrice looked up at him, her eyes reflecting both the fading light and the promise of all that lay ahead. "But our story is just beginning, Mr. Norwood," she replied. "And I suspect it may be the greatest adventure either of us has ever known."